The morning of June 6, 1944, carved itself into history with blood and fire, but what few know is that one man's story began years before, in a small town in Virginia where nobody expected a hero to emerge. Thomas Bradford grew up in Richmond, Virginia, in a modest two-story house on Maple Street. His father, William Bradford, was a carpenter who built furniture with his bare hands, and his mother, Eleanor, worked as a seamstress. Thomas was the youngest of three brothers, always the quiet one, the one who preferred books over baseball, who spent afternoons reading about ancient battles while his brothers played in the yard. In 1938, when Thomas turned 18, the world was already trembling. Europe whispered of war, and America tried to pretend it wasn't listening. Thomas enrolled at the University of Virginia to study history, fascinated by military strategy and the great commanders of the past. His professors noticed something unusual about him. He didn't just memorize dates and names. He understood the psychology of war, the moment when everything hangs by a thread and one decision changes everything. But in December 1941, everything changed. Pearl Harbor brought the war crashing into American living rooms. Thomas's two older brothers, James and Robert, enlisted immediately. The family gathered around the radio every night, listening to news of battles in distant lands, of victories and losses, of sons who never came home. Thomas wanted to enlist, but his father begged him to finish his degree first. "You have a mind for this," William told him. "The army needs thinkers, not just soldiers." So Thomas stayed, studying harder than ever, devouring every book on military tactics he could find. But guilt ate at him. While his brothers fought, he sat in lecture halls. In the spring of 1943, both James and Robert returned home. James had lost his left arm in North Africa. Robert came back different, quieter, with eyes that had seen too much. They never talked about what happened over there, but Thomas saw it in their faces every day. That summer, Thomas made his decision. He walked into the recruitment office in downtown Richmond on a scorching July afternoon. The sergeant behind the desk was a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek. "Name," the sergeant said without looking up. "Thomas Bradford," he replied. The sergeant glanced at him, taking in his thin frame, his glasses, his soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a textbook. "You sure about this, son? You don't look like soldier material." Thomas met his gaze without flinching. "I'm sure." The training was brutal. Fort Benning, Georgia, became his hell for 12 weeks. Thomas had never pushed his body like this. 5-mile runs before dawn, obstacle courses that left him bleeding and bruised, hand-to-hand combat drills where bigger men threw him around like a rag doll. At night, he collapsed into his bunk, every muscle screaming, while other recruits mocked him. "Hey, Professor," one of them called out, "why don't you go back to your books? This ain't no library." But Thomas didn't quit. He studied his fellow soldiers the way he studied history books, learning their strengths, their weaknesses, their patterns. He couldn't outmuscle them, so he outsmarted them. During tactical exercises, his squad started winning because Thomas saw angles others missed, anticipated moves before they happened. His drill sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant O'Connor, pulled him aside one evening. "Bradford, you're not the strongest or the fastest, but you've got something these other boys don't. You think 3 steps ahead. That's what keeps men alive in combat." By October 1943, Thomas graduated from basic training. Instead of being assigned to a regular infantry unit, he received unusual orders: report to a special training facility in Maryland for further instruction. When he arrived, he discovered he'd been selected for a unique program training soldiers in unconventional warfare, survival tactics, and rapid decision-making under extreme pressure. The instructors were British commandos, hard men with cold eyes who had survived operations Thomas had only read about. They taught him things not found in any textbook: how to survive behind enemy lines with nothing, how to turn everyday objects into weapons, how to think clearly when death breathed down your neck. One instructor, a captain named Davies, took particular interest in Thomas. During a nighttime navigation exercise through the woods, when Thomas improvised a shelter using only branches and his own jacket, Davies nodded approvingly. "War isn't about having the best equipment," he said. "It's about using what you have when you have nothing left." In March 1944, Thomas received his assignment. He would join British forces as an American liaison officer for the upcoming invasion of France. His specialized training made him valuable for coordinated operations. His family gathered at the train station in Richmond to see him off. His mother held him tight, crying into his shoulder. His father shook his hand firmly, pride and fear mixing in his eyes. James and Robert stood side by side, both knowing what he was about to face. "Take care of yourself, little brother," Robert said quietly. Thomas boarded the train, watching Virginia disappear behind him, not knowing that in 3 months, he would face a moment that would define not just his life, but become a story whispered in military circles for decades to come. Thomas arrived in England in early April 1944, assigned to the 2nd Battalion of the British Army's Special Operations Unit stationed near Southampton. The base was a converted manor house surrounded by barbed wire and constant drills. The British soldiers regarded him with suspicion at first. An American among Brits, a bookish officer who looked like he belonged in a university rather than a combat unit. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison, his commanding officer, was a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for breaking soldiers who couldn't handle pressure. During their first meeting, Harrison sat behind his desk, studying Thomas's file with barely concealed skepticism. "An American liaison with special training," he read aloud. "Tell me, Bradford, what exactly makes you think you can operate with my men? We don't have room for tourists on this mission." Thomas stood straight, meeting his gaze. "I'm not here to be a tourist, sir. I'm here to do whatever it takes." Harrison leaned back in his chair. "We'll see about that." The training intensified beyond anything Thomas had experienced. Nighttime beach landings in freezing water, live fire exercises where bullets zipped inches over their heads, combat simulations designed to break their spirits. The British soldiers pushed harder, testing him constantly. During one particularly brutal exercise, Sergeant Mills, a stocky soldier with cauliflower ears, deliberately sabotaged Thomas's equipment during a cliff climbing drill. Thomas discovered his rope had been cut halfway through only when he was 50 feet up. He felt it start to give, the fibers snapping one by one. Below him, Mills watched with crossed arms, waiting for him to panic, to cry for help, to quit. Instead, Thomas wedged his body into a crevice, removed his belt, and used it to secure himself while he slowly worked his way up using only his hands and feet, no rope. When he reached the top, bleeding and exhausted, Mills was waiting. "Trying to kill me won't make you better soldiers," Thomas said quietly, walking past him. That night, Mills cornered him in the barracks. Several other soldiers gathered around, forming a circle. "You think you're clever, Yank? You think you belong here with us?" Mills shoved him hard against the wall. "My brother died at Dunkirk. My father died in the last war. This is our fight, not yours. You're just here playing hero." Thomas didn't fight back. He looked Mills in the eye and spoke with quiet intensity. "My brothers both came home broken from this war. One lost his arm. The other lost himself. I know what this fight costs. I'm not playing anything." The tension hung thick in the air. Then Harrison's voice cut through. "That's enough, Mills. Stand down." The soldiers dispersed, but the hostility remained. Thomas lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd survive his own unit before he even faced the enemy. Outside, the spring rain hammered against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, the invasion fleet was being prepared. Time was running out, and Thomas Bradford was still fighting to prove he deserved to be there. Everything changed on May 28, 1944, during what was supposed to be a routine reconnaissance exercise along the English coast. Thomas's unit was tasked with surveying potential landing zones, identifying obstacles, and timing the tidal patterns. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison led 12 men through the misty dawn, including Thomas and Sergeant Mills. They were examining a stretch of beach when German reconnaissance planes appeared overhead. The alarm went up too late. The Luftwaffe had been patrolling more aggressively, and this squadron had slipped through the radar net. Within seconds, machine gun fire ripped across the sand. 2 soldiers fell immediately. The rest scrambled for cover behind a rocky outcrop, but they were exposed, pinned down with nowhere to go. Harrison barked orders, trying to organize a retreat, but the planes circled back for another pass. Thomas saw Mills dragging a wounded private named Cooper toward cover, but Cooper's leg was shattered, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. The planes descended for a third strike. Thomas knew they had maybe 30 seconds before those guns tore them apart. His mind raced, processing angles, distances, possibilities. Then he saw it, an old wooden fence post, half buried in the sand about 40 yards away, marking some forgotten property line. Beyond it, a drainage ditch that led inland, deep enough to provide cover. Thomas sprinted. Bullets kicked up sand around his feet as he ran in a zigzag pattern, exactly as he'd been trained. He reached the fence post, yanked it free from the sand with strength born of pure adrenaline, and began waving it frantically, running parallel to the beach. The planes spotted the movement, their guns swiveling toward him. He was drawing their fire away from his unit. Harrison screamed at him to get down, but Thomas kept running, kept waving that fence post like a flag, leading the planes further down the beach. The Germans took the bait, focusing their attack on this single mad target. Thomas Dove rolled, came up running again, his lungs burning, his heart hammering so hard he thought it would burst. Then he reached the drainage ditch and threw himself in. The planes roared overhead, confused, circling to relocate their target. Those precious seconds gave Harrison and the others time to retreat inland, carrying their wounded. When the planes finally left and the unit regrouped 2 miles inland, they found Thomas sitting in that ditch, covered in mud, still clutching the fence post, shaking from exhaustion and shock. Mills approached slowly, his face unreadable. Then he extended his hand. "You saved our lives, Yank. All of us." Thomas took his hand, and Mills pulled him up. Harrison stood watching, something different in his eyes now. Respect. If you're wondering whether Thomas Bradford truly belonged with these men, whether one moment of courage could change everything, then stay with this story because what happened next at sunrise on June 6th would prove that heroes aren't born, they're forged in the fire of impossible choices. Subscribe to see how this quiet kid from Virginia became a legend. June 6, 1944. D-Day. The invasion fleet cut through rough waters toward Normandy's beaches under a sky still dark with pre-dawn shadows. Thomas stood on the landing craft alongside his unit, feeling the boat rise and fall with each wave. Around him, men checked their weapons, some prayed, others vomited from seasickness and fear. Mills stood beside him now, no longer an enemy but a brother in arms. The ramp dropped at 0630 hours. Omaha Beach erupted in chaos. Machine gun fire tore through the first wave of soldiers before they even reached the sand. Men fell into water turned red, their bodies floating in the surf. Thomas waded through hell itself, dragging wounded soldiers toward cover, his ears ringing from explosions that shook the earth. By noon, his unit had pushed inland, fighting through hedgerows and fortified German positions. They reached a small French village called Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer, where intelligence reported a German command post coordinating counterattacks against the beach. Harrison gathered his remaining men, now down to 23 from the original 40. "We take that command post, we save hundreds of lives on the beach. Who's with me?" Every hand went up. They moved through the village under cover of smoke and artillery fire. The command post was an old stone church, its tower providing perfect observation of the beaches. German soldiers had fortified it heavily, with machine gun nests and barbed wire surrounding the perimeter. Harrison studied the position, calculating odds that weren't in their favor. Thomas saw something others missed. A small basement window on the church's north side, partially hidden by overgrown vines, likely a coal chute from before the war. He pointed it out to Harrison. "If I can get inside through there, I can open the main door from within. You hit them from the front when I signal." Harrison shook his head. "That's suicide, Bradford. You'll be alone in there with at least 20 Germans." Thomas checked his rifle, his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. "Someone has to do it, sir." Mills grabbed his shoulder. "Then I'm coming with you." "No," Thomas said firmly. "You're needed out here. This is something I have to do alone." At 1,700 hours, as the sun began its descent, Thomas crawled through mud and debris toward that basement window. Behind him, his unit waited in position. He slipped through the narrow opening, dropping into darkness that smelled of mold and gunpowder. Above him, he heard German voices, footsteps, the clatter of equipment. He moved through the basement like a shadow, his training taking over. Every sound amplified in his ears. Every heartbeat felt like thunder. He found the stairs leading up, weapon ready, knowing that in minutes he would either open that door for his brothers or die trying. The quiet kid from Virginia who once preferred books to battles was gone. In his place stood a soldier ready to face whatever came next. Thomas climbed the stone stairs, each step deliberate and silent. At the top, he pressed his ear against the wooden door. German voices argued about troop movements, coordinates, artillery positions. He counted at least 8 distinct voices in the main room, plus more scattered throughout the church. His hand found the door handle. One deep breath. Then he kicked it open. The element of surprise gave him 3 seconds. 3 seconds where trained reflexes took over and his rifle barked 4 times. 4 German soldiers fell before the others could react. Thomas dove behind a heavy wooden pew as return fire splintered the wood above his head. Outside, Harrison heard the gunfire. "That's the signal. Move, move, move." The British unit stormed the church entrance. Explosions blew the front doors off their hinges. Germans caught between Thomas inside and Harrison's men outside found themselves in a deadly crossfire. The battle raged through the church, bullets ricocheting off stone walls, grenades shaking the ancient foundations. Thomas moved like he'd been doing this his entire life. He flanked 3 Germans trying to set up a machine gun, taking them down before they could fire. He cleared the bell tower room by room, finding a German radio operator frantically trying to call for reinforcements. The operator reached for his sidearm, but Thomas was faster. Mills burst through a side door, covering Thomas's blind spot and dropping 2 Germans who'd been circling behind him. Back to back, the American and the Brit fought their way to the main altar where the German commander had barricaded himself with his remaining men. The commander, an officer named Hauptmann Weber, shouted in accented English. "You cannot win. More soldiers are coming. Surrender now." Thomas stepped forward, his voice steady. "Your men are dead or captured. Your radio is destroyed. The beach is ours. It's over." Weber looked around at his fallen soldiers, at the blood staining the church floor, at the Allied soldiers surrounding him. His hand moved toward his weapon. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger, but Weber's hand stopped. Slowly, the German officer removed his pistol and placed it on the altar. His remaining 7 soldiers followed suit. 21 German soldiers lay dead in that church. 21 men who would never coordinate another attack on the beach, never call in artillery on Allied positions, never send more soldiers to their deaths. Harrison entered, surveying the scene with amazement. "Bradford, you magnificent bastard. You actually did it." The unit secured the command post, finding maps, codebooks, and intelligence that would prove invaluable in the coming days. As evening fell, Thomas stood in the church doorway, looking out at the village. Smoke rose from distant battles. The sound of war continued, but here, in this moment, they had one. Mills approached, offering him a canteen. You know what the lads are calling you now? The ghost of Saint Laurent. The Yank who walks through walls. Thomas took a drink, his hands finally starting to shake as the adrenaline faded. I just did what needed to be done. No, Mills said quietly. You did what none of us could. September 1946. Richmond, Virginia. 2 years after the war ended. Thomas Bradford stood in front of a classroom at the University of Virginia, no longer a student but a professor of military history. The war had aged him in ways that went beyond the gray streaks in his hair or the scars hidden beneath his shirt. His students sat quietly as he recounted battles, strategies, moments where single decisions changed the course of history. But he never told them about Saint-Laurent-sur-Mer. He never mentioned the fence post on the beach or the 21 Germans in the church. Some stories stayed locked inside, too heavy to share with young faces that had never known war. After class, a student approached him. Professor Bradford, is it true you served in the war? Thomas gathered his papers, considering his answer. I did my part, like many others. The student persisted. My father said you were decorated. That you received the Distinguished Service Cross and the British Military Cross. That you were a hero. Thomas looked at the young man, seeing echoes of his own youthful face from years ago. Heroes are the ones who didn't come home. I was just lucky. But luck hadn't brought him through that church. Training had. Courage had. The willingness to do what terrified him because others depended on him. He thought of James, who'd learned to write left-handed after losing his arm. Of Robert, who still woke up screaming some nights. Of Mills, who'd returned to Liverpool to rebuild his family's bombed-out home. Of Harrison, who'd stayed in the army, training new generations of soldiers. Of Cooper, who'd survived that beach because Thomas had drawn fire with a fence post. That evening, Thomas walked to his childhood home on Maple Street. His mother was setting the dinner table, his father reading the newspaper in his worn armchair. The house smelled of pot roast and fresh bread, ordinary smells that once seemed boring but now felt like miracles. His mother hugged him as she did every time he visited, holding on just a little too long, still unable to fully believe he'd made it home. She'd lost too many neighbors' sons to trust that peace was permanent. Over dinner, his father asked about his classes, his research, his life. They talked about small things, everyday things, the kind of conversations that soldiers dream about when they're cold and scared and far from home. Later, Thomas helped wash dishes while his mother hummed an old song, and he realized this was what he'd fought for. Not glory or medals or recognition, but this ordinary moments with people he loved, in a country at peace. The quiet kid from Virginia who'd once preferred books to battles had learned that real courage wasn't about being unafraid. It was about being terrified and doing what needed to be done anyway. And sometimes, that courage came from the most unexpected places, wielded by the most unlikely heroes. If this story moved you, if you believe that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when the moment demands it, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. What stories of courage from your own family's history should we tell next? Thank you for staying until the end. Remember, heroes aren't born. They're made in moments when giving up would be easier than going forward. Until next time, keep these stories alive.